Thanks, Mark. I'm Simon Barton. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Sherwood Forest Hospitals. Ben?
Ben Owens, ED Consultant and Clinical Chair for the Urgent Care Division.
Ben and I are going to do something which is a lot harder than sort of managing escalation, which is do a double act presentation in different offices and try and make it look seamless. So I'm going to kick off a little bit. If you want to move on to the next slide, please. Next one. Thank you. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think the previous two presentations have talked a lot about the risk itself, particularly of crowding. Sorry, just go back one. But I did want to sort of like just pick up a few points on here, which is largely about the calibration of risk across a hospital. And the perspective of risk across a hospital, and tell a brief story about that probably happens in lots of hospitals every day, where two people are right but are viewing risk in the same way. So us, like most hospitals, we had we have difficult winters, and occasionally patients get held up in recovery at times. And I had a surgeon within the organisation who went back to the ward one evening to try and see their patient, who wasn't on the ward yet. They were still held in recovery. He understandably wanted the phone number of the Chief Operating Officer, and he came to see me, and we had a conversation about risk. And in that conversation, he was rightly concerned with the risk to his patient, and I was rightly concerned with the risk to 600 patients within the hospital and other risks across the organisation. And we had a really good conversation, and we were both seeing the risk from a different perspective. And I think in the management of risk, that is what you're largely trying to manage, is the balance between those two things. The other point I will also mention around this will be about this availability heuristic, which is risk is often sort of constrained by a story of something that may or may not have happened many moons ago. And that sort of drives a protocol that is unbreakable in many ways. And hospitals are protocolized for lots of good reasons. But sometimes you have to balance risk by looking at what might be outside of those protocols in times of difficulty. But we all know that overcrowded areas, not just emergency departments, overcrowded areas create risk for patients. They reduce the staff to patient ratio. There might not be any oxygen, all those other services, and there's certainly no dignity for patients. So if you just want to move on. I think in hospitals under pressure, what I've seen a lot during my career is one bit of the hospital is taking huge risk, and the rest of the hospital is running with what we call a business as usual risk. So they're sort of like merrily working on that while this bit of the hospital is in big trouble, and the patients there are at risk. And I think one of the things that we've tried to do is just work on the sort of behavioural bit rather than process of people just accepting risks that might not be in their area and risk that they can't see. And a sort of like an easy one of that is like a ward understanding the risk to crowding in emergency departments, for example, because what you're asking is a different risk appetite rather than necessarily just managing business as usual when different parts of the hospital on risk. So you're talking about different levels of risk control, but a different appetite for risk within that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Ben, at this stage. Or
no, I think you're absolutely right, and it's that perception of risk in your own area, and actually everyone realising that we all contribute to the risk of every patient across the whole system, and it's not part of our training, but actually we are accountable for all our actions, not the results of our actions, not just the patients in front of us, but for all patients. And that's exactly true of EDs. If EDs admit people they don't need admitting, they add to that problem on the wards and the risks to the wards. So we're all parts of the system are part of that process. It's how we communicate that and balance that, and it will change on a daily basis depending on the problem as well. You can't write a protocol for it all because it will change depending what the challenge we face is. Is it influx of ambulances? Is it outflow from the wards? Is it staffing on the wards, staffing in ED? You can't write a protocol that covers all those things. It has to be a judgment and a communication.
Thank you. So if we just move on to the next slide. Thank you. So these are some of the sort of practical things that that we try to do. These are obviously embodied in risk assessments and policies across the organisation, and action cards, and all of that sort of stuff. And I think Ben will probably go through them more in a little bit of detail. But I think that the first thing from my perspective is really that behavioural aspect. And I think ambulances is pretty important around this. So my view is that there's no other larger unmitigated risk in the NHS than someone dialing 999 and no one turning up or turning up late, because ambulances are held up at hospitals. And we've really talked to our colleagues about how important that is. And I think there's been a huge amount of buy-in to that, and therefore buy-in to making sure other areas of the organisation aren't overcrowded. You cannot communicate enough when you're going into escalation. So just as an example, I'm sure this is done in lots of organisations, but when I walk around the organisation, if we're on Opal 4, or we still call it Black Alert internally, every screensaver is on black and it says Black Alert across the top of it, and it's very clear about the risk that is happening in the organisation, and therefore no one in the whole trust can be unclear of what a difficult situation the organisation is in. And then the final bit that I wanted to point that I wanted to make before I hand over to Ben to go through some of the rest of this is that we're clear on our red lines, and we will not put patients in endoscopy, the cath lab, the discharge lounge, bedding them in AECU, because it's not right for those patients, and also it takes away the reason for changing the system to be able to make it flow better. So we're really clear on our red lines, and I think that's really important. And then I'll hand over to Ben to go through all the other aspects.
Thanks, Simon. I think you put it well. And the key thing is that ambulances are, no one's treating that patient in the community. There's no support for them. There's no one seeing them. So they are the greatest risk we've got. And it's offsetting that against people who are going home or have the potential to go home. At the end of their stay, they're probably as well as they're going to be in that period, and they've got support around them. So it's how we balance those two things off. Really crucially, and Simon will do this, and we do it a lot, is you don't talk about targets. Yes, there's a 4-hour target that is a measure of flow and capacity in the organisation. It's also a measure of efficiency of the department and ED. Whether you like it or not, whether it's going or not, it doesn't motivate people. We got 92%, we got 93%, but actually by saying we're in escalation, there's now a 92-year-old Bob, whoever it is, he's now been on a trolley in ED for 6 hours, and their care will be being compromised. If that was your relative, what would you do right now? How would you behave knowing that? And it's bringing it back to that patient that's been waiting the longest, particularly the vulnerable, the frail elderly. At the moment, it's talking about nosocomial infection in COVID, and it's getting buy-in. I think we've got that around the worst place possible to have an overcrowded ED where you've got cross infection, but it's equally you can't then not take ambulances because that person in the community is even at a higher risk. So the balancing risk factor of this is you will take different actions that you might not do on a normal day, but that you would do on another day. So you would send TTO is a really great example. You would send people home without their TTO and make sure they came back for it or taxi took it to them if they're a mobile independent adult, because they would do that from the ED and then frees up a bed. You wouldn't do that in ideal circumstances, but you do that in escalation. That's a minor example, but you would change your behaviour. You have to change your behaviour to get a different outcome. It's not getting every patient seen again by the medical teams or the surgical teams. It's asking those to look at those that are likely to go home, so they know the low news scores, etc. It's about when we are busy, it's about pulling people from areas that are less acute to help out for fixed periods of time. So you might pull staff in practice development teams, other things to help out an ED. You may move resource around the hospital to meet the demand you've got. So if it's phlebotomy, it's an issue, you get more phlebotomy teams into the right area. If sickness is an issue, you move staff around. It's balancing that risk off all the time. Next slide, please. And the crucial thing is about trust, and it won't always work, and you've got to accept that it won't work, and when it goes wrong, we have to learn from it. But actually, so it's how we balance that risk, or how we change our risk appetite, just as we do in life all the time. The red areas are quite right. We don't put people in SDEC because it might solve a problem briefly overnight and it makes it worse the next day. If you've got non-ambulatory care, you admit more people, or more people sit in your ED. That does not help you overall. So that's the balance of risk there. And also it's about response. Every bed meeting must have a bronze or a silver who attends 5 times a day, and their job is to solve problems. The point of the bed meeting is to go away and solve problems, or come back and say when they can't, and it's about that constant peer challenge. And the final thing I wanted to say was it's about, this is mostly predictable. We know when this is going to happen. We use a tool in advance to predict it based on our bed state and our average ambulances. So we know in advance if we have to step down surgery, we step it down the right patients done the daytime. If we have to outlie, every ward must identify 2 people to outlie in the daytime on the least worst option. So it's not the med reg at 4 in the morning trying to do it. And these things will still happen. But if we plan for it, the right decisions are made. And I think the answer is, it's about having your red lines. It's about planning as much in advance as you can. It's about that open communication about, we won't cancel operations. We don't want to cancel anyone. But if we do, when do we do it? How do we do it? How do we make sure we minimise that risk? It's about owning it. So EDs have to own the fact that we discharge 75% of our patients. So some of our crowding is our own making, and we have to own that. So the challenge to the trust is give us beds. The challenge to our trust to us is, what are you doing to minimise your own occupancy? So it's a two-way flow there, and it's about learning every day, I think, is the final thing I'd say.